calling it merely for the moment electricity, we know that all experimental analysis of electricity has given as an ultimate result the principle, or seeming principle, heterogeneity. Only where things differ is electricity apparent. And it is presumable that they never differ where it is not developed, at least if not apparent. Now, this result is in the fullest keeping with that which I have reached unempirically. The design of the repulsive influence I've maintained to be that of preventing immediate unity among the diffused atoms, and these atoms are represented as different from each. Difference is their character, their essentiality, just as no difference was the essentiality of their source. When we say, then, that an attempt to bring any two of these atoms together would induce an effort on the part of the repulsive influence, to prevent the contact, we may as well use the strictly convertible sentence that an attempt to bring together any two differences will result in the development of electricity. All existing bodies, of course, are composed of these atoms in proximate contact, and are therefore to be considered as mere assemblages of more or fewer differences, and the resistance made by the repulsive spirit on bringing together any two such assemblages would be in the ratio of the two sums of the differences in each. An expression which, when reduced, is equivalent to this: the amount of electricity developed on the approximation of two bodies is proportional to the difference between the respective sums of the atoms of which the bodies are composed. That no two bodies are absolutely alike is a simple corollary from all that has been here said. Electricity, therefore, existing always, is developed whenever any bodies, but manifested only when bodies of appreciable difference are brought into approximation to electricity, so for the present, continuing to call it. We may not be wrong in referring the various physical appearances of light, heat, and magnetism, but far less shall we be liable to err in attributing to this strictly spiritual principle the more important phenomena of vitality, consciousness, and thought. On this topic, however, I need pause here merely to suggest that these phenomena, whether observed generally or in detail, seem to proceed at least in the ratio of the heterogeneous. Discarding now the two equivocal terms, gravitation and electricity, let us adopt the more definite expressions, attraction and repulsion. The former is the body, the latter the soul. The one is material, the other the spiritual principle of the universe. No other principles exist. All phenomena are referable to one, or to the other, or to both combined. So rigorously is this the case. So thoroughly demonstrable that attraction and repulsion are the sole properties through which we perceive the universe. In other words, by which matter is manifested to mind. That for all merely argumentative purposes, we are fully justified in assuming that matter exists only as attraction and repulsion. That attraction and repulsion are matter. There being no conceivable case in which we may not employ the term matter and the terms attraction and repulsion taken together as equivalent and therefore convertible expressions of logic. I said just now that what I've described as the tendency of the diffused atoms to return into their original unity would be understood as the principle of the Newtonian law of gravity. And in fact, there can be little difficulty in such an understanding if we look into the Newtonian gravity in a merely general view, as a force impelling matter to seek matter. That is to say, when we pay no attention to the force impelling matter, when we pay no attention to the known modus operandi of the Newtonian force, the general coincidence satisfies us, but upon looking closely, we see in detail much that appears incoincident, and much in regard to which no coincidence, at least, is established. For example, the Newtonian gravity, when we think of it as in certain moods, does not seem to be a tendency to oneness at all, but rather a tendency to all bodies in all directions. A phrase apparently expressive of a tendency to diffusion. Here, then, is an incoincidence. Again, when we reflect on the mathematical law governing the Newtonian tendency, we see clearly that no coincidence has been made good. In respect to the modus operandi, at least between gravitation as known to exist and that seemingly simple and direct tendency which I have assumed. In fact, I have attained a point at which it will be advisable to strengthen my position by reversing my processes. So far, we have gone on a priori from an abstract consideration of simplicity as that quality most likely to have characterized the original action of God. Let us now see whether the established facts of the Newtonian gravitation may not afford us a posteriori some legitimate inductions. What does the Newtonian law declare? That all bodies attract with each other with forces proportional to their quantities of matter and inversely proportional to the squares of their distances. Purposely, I have here given, in the first place, the vulgar version of the law, and I confess that in this, as in most other vulgar versions of great truths, we find little of a suggestive character. Let us now adopt a more philosophical phraseology. Every atom of every body attracts every other atom, both of its own and of every other body, with a force which varies inversely as the squares of the distances between the attracting and the attracted atom. Here, indeed, a flood of suggestion burst upon the mind. But let us see distinctly what it was that Newton proved. According to the grossly irrational definitions of proof prescribed by the metaphysical school, he was forced to content himself with showing how thoroughly the motions of an imaginary universe, composed of attraction and attracted atoms, obedient to the law he announced, coincide with those of the actual existing universe, so far as it comes under our observation. This was the amount of his demonstration, that is to say, this was the amount of it according to the conventional cant of the quote-unquote philosophies. His successes added proof multiplied by proof. Such proof is a sound intellect admits, but the demonstration of the law itself, persisted metaphysicians, had not been strengthened in any degree. Ocular physical proof, however, of attraction here upon Earth, in accordance with the Newtonian theory, was at length much to the satisfaction of some intellectual grovellers afforded. This proof arose collaterally and incidentally, as nearly all important truths have arisen, out of an attempt to ascertain the mean density of Earth. In the famous Maskelyne, Cavendish, and Bailey experiments for this purpose, the attraction of the mass of a mountain was seen, felt, measured, and found to be mathematically consistent with the immortal theory of the British astronomer. But in spite of this confirmation of that which needed none, in spite of that so-called corroboration of the quote-unquote theory, by the so-called quote-unquote ocular and physical proof, in spite of the character of this corroboration, the ideas of which even really philosophical men cannot help imbibing of gravity, and especially the ideas of it which ordinary men get and contentedly maintain, are seen to have been derived for the most part from a consideration of the principle as they find developed, merely in the planet upon which they stand. Now, to what does so partial a consideration contend? To what species of error does it give rise? On the Earth we see and feel only that gravity impels all bodies towards the center of the Earth. No man in the common walks of life could be made to see or feel anything else, could be made to perceive that anything anywhere has a perpetual gravitating tendency in any other direction than that to the center of the Earth. Yet, with an exception hereafter to be specified, it is a fact that every earthly thing, not to speak now of every heavenly thing, has a tendency not only to the Earth's center, but in every conceivable direction besides. Now, although the philosophic cannot be said to err with the vulgar in this matter, they nevertheless permit themselves to be influenced, without knowing it, by the sentiment of the vulgar idea. Although the pagan fables are not believed, says Bryant in his very erudite mythology, yet we forget ourselves continually and make inferences from them as from existing realities. I mean to assert that the merely sensitive perception of gravity, as we experience it on Earth, beguiles mankind into the fancy of consensualization, or a speciality respecting it, has been continually biasing towards this fancy even the mightiest intellects, perpetually, although imperceptibly, leading them away from the real characteristics of the principle, thus preventing them, up to this date, from ever getting a glimpse of the vital truth which lies in a diametrically opposite direction behind the principle's essential characteristics, those not of the concentralization or speciality, but of universality and diffusion. This quote-unquote vital truth is unity as the source of the phenomenon. Let me now repeat the definition of gravity. Every atom of every body attracts every other atom, both in its own and of every body, with a force which varies inversely as the squares of the distance of that attracting and attracted atom. Here, let the reader pause with me for a moment in the contemplation of the miraculous, of the ineffable, of the altogether and unimaginable complexity of relation involved in this fact that each atom attracts every other atom. Involved merely in this fact of attraction without reference to the law or mode in which the attraction is manifested. Involved merely in the fact that each atom attracts every other atom at all. In a wilderness of atoms so numerous that those which go to the composition of a cannonball exceed, probably, in mere point of number, all the stars which go to the constitution of the universe. Had we discovered simply that each atom tended to some one favorite point, to some special, especially attractive atom, we should still have fallen upon a discovery which, in itself, would have sufficed to overwhelm the mind. But what is it that we are actually called upon to comprehend? That each atom attracts, sympathizes with the most delicate movements of every other atom, and with each and with all at the same time and forever, and according to a determinate law of which the complexity even considered by itself solely is utterly beyond the grasp of the imagination of man. If I propose to ascertain the influence of one mote in a sunbeam upon its neighboring mote, I cannot accomplish my purpose without first counting and weighting all the atoms in the universe and defining the precise positions of all at one particular moment. If I venture to displace by even the billionth part of an inch the microscopical speck of dust which lies now upon the point of my finger, what is the character of that act upon which I have adventured? I have done a deed which shakes the moon in her path, which causes the sun to be no longer the sun, and which alters forever the destiny of the multitudinous myriads of stars that roll and glow in the majestic presence of their Creator. These ideas, conceptions such as these, unthought-like thoughts, soul reveries rather than conclusions, or even considerations of the intellect. Ideas, I repeat, such as these are such as we can alone hope profitably to entertain in any effort at grasping the great principle, attraction. But now with such ideas, with such a vision of the marvelous complexity of attraction fairly in his mind, let any person competent of thought on such topics as these set himself into the task of imagining the principle for the phenomena observed, a condition from which they sprang. Does not so evident a brotherhood among those atoms point to a common parentage? Does not a sympathy so omniprevalent, so ineradicable, and so irrespective suggest a common paternity as its source? Does not one extreme impel the reason to the other? Does not the infinitude of the vision refer to the utterness of individuality? Does not the entireness of the complex hint at the perfection of the symbol? Is it not that the atoms as we see them are divided, or is it that they are complex in their relations, but that they are inconceivably divided or unutterably complex? It is with the extremeness of the conditions to which I now allude, rather than to the conditions themselves. In a word, is it not because the atoms were at some remote epoch of time even more than together? Is it not because originally, and therefore normally, they were one, that now in all circumstances, at all points, in all directions, by all modes of approach, in all relations through all conditions, they struggle back this absolutely, this irrelatively, this unconditionally one? Some person here may demand, why? Since it is to the one that the atoms struggle back, do we not find and define attraction a mere general tendency to a center? Why, in especial, do not your atoms, which you describe as having been irradiated from a center, proceed at once rectilinearly back to the central point of their origin? I reply that they do, and will be distinctly shown, but that the cause of their so doing is quite irrespective of the center as such. They all tend rectilinearly toward the center because of the sphericity with which they have been irradiated in space. Each atom, forming one of a generally uniform globe of atoms, finds more atoms in the direction of the center, of course, than in any other, but in that direction, therefore, it is impelled. But is it not thus impelled because the center is the point of origin? It is not to any point that the atoms are allied. It is not to any locality, either in the concrete or the abstract, to which I suppose them bound. Nothing like location was their parent, was conceived as their origin. Their source lies in the principal unity. This is their lost parent. This they seek always, immediately, in all directions, whenever, wherever it is even partially to be found, thus appeasing, in some measure, the ineradicable tendency. Any principle which shall be inadequate to account for the law, or modus operandi, of the attraction force in general, will account for this law in particular. That is to say, any principle which will show why the atoms should tend to their general center of irradiation with forces inversely proportional to the squares of the distances, will be admitted as satisfactorily accounting at the same time for the tendency according to the same law of these atoms each to each. For the tendency to the center is merely seen For the tendency to the center is merely the tendency each to each, and not any tendency to a center to each. Thus it will be seen as also that the establishment of my proportions would involve no necessity of modification, and in terms of the Newtonian definition of gravity, which declares that each atom attracts each other atom and so forth, and declares this merely, but always under the supposition of that what I proposed to be in the end admitted. It seems clear that some error might occasionally be avoided in the future processes of science were a more ample phraseology adopted. For instance, quote, each atom tends to each other atom, etc., with a force, etc. The general result being a tendency of all with a similar force to a general center, unquote. The reversal of our processes has thus brought us to an identical result. But while in the one process intuition was the starting point, and in the other was the goal. In commencing the former journey, I could only say that with an irresistible intuition, I felt simplicity to have been the characteristic of the original action of God. In ending the latter, I can only declare that with an irresistible intuition, I perceive unity to have been the source of the observed phenomena of the Newtonian gravitation. Thus, according to the schools, I proved nothing. So be it. I design but to suggest, and to convince through the suggestion. I am proudly aware that there exist many of the most profound and cautiously discriminative human intellects, which cannot help but be abundantly content with my suggestions. To these intellects, as to my own, there is no mathematical demonstration which could bring the least additional true proof of the great truth which I've advanced. The truth of original unity as the source, as the principle of the universal phenomena. For my part, it is, I am sure, I am not so sure that I speak and see. I am not so sure that my heart beats and that my soul lives. Of the rising of tomorrow's sun, a probability that as yet lies in the future, I do not pretend to be 1,000th part sure, as I am of the irretrievably bygone fact that all things and all thoughts of things, with their ineffable multiplicity of relation, sprang at once into being from the primordial and irrelative one. Referring to the Newtonian gravity, Dr. Nicol, the eloquent author of The Architecture of the Heavens, says, quote, "In truth, we have no reason to suppose this great law, as now revealed to be the ultimate or simplest, and therefore the universal and all-comprehensive form of a great ordinance, the mode in which its tendency diminishes with the element of distance, has not the aspect of the ultimate principle, which always assumes the simplicity and self-evidence of those axioms which constitute the basis of geometry," unquote. Now, it is quite true that, quote-unquote, ultimate principles, in the common understanding of the words, always assume the simplicity of geometrical axioms. As for self-evidence, there is no such thing. But these principles are clearly not ultimate. In other terms, what we are in the habit of calling principles are no principles, properly speaking, since there can be but one principle, the volition of God. We have no right to assume, then, from what we observe in rules that we choose to foolishly to name principles, anything at all in respect to the characteristics of a principle proper. The quote-unquote ultimate principles, of which Dr. Nicol speaks, as having geometrical simplicity, may and do have this geometrical turn, as being part and partial of a vast geometrical system, and thus a system of simplicity itself, in which, nevertheless, the truly ultimate principle is, as we know it, the consummation of the complex, that is to say, of the unintelligible. For is it not the spiritual capacity of God? I quote Dr. Nicol's remark, however, not so much to question its philosophy as by way of calling attention to the fact that while all men have admitted some principle as existing behind the law of gravity, no attempt has been made yet to point out what this principle in particular is. If we accept, perhaps, the occasional fantastic efforts as referring to it as magnetism or mesmerism or Swedenborgianism, or transcendentalism, or some other equally delicious ism of the same species, and invariably patronized by one and same species of people. The great mind of Newton, while boldly grasping the law itself, shrank from the principle of the law. The more fluent and comprehensive, at least, if not the more patient and profound, sagacity of Laplace had not the courage to attack it, but hesitation on the part of these two astronomers it is perhaps not so very difficult to understand. They, as well as the first class of mathematicians, were mathematicians solely. Their intellect, at least, had a firmly pronounced mathematico-physical tone. What lay not distinctly within the domain of physics or of mathematics seems to them either non-entity or shadow. Nevertheless, we may well wonder what that Leibniz, who was a marked exception to the general rule in these respects, and whose mental temperament was a singular admixture of the mathematical with the physico-metaphysical, did not at once investigate and establish the point at issue. Either Newton or Laplace, seeking a principle and discovering non-physical, would have rested contentedly in the conclusion that there was absolutely none. But it is also impossible to fancy, of course, of Leibniz that, having exhausted in his search the physical dominions, he would not have stepped at once boldly and hopefully amid his old familiar haunts in the kingdom of metaphysics. Here, indeed, it is clear that he must have adventured in the search of treasure. That he did not find it after all was perhaps because his fairy guide imagination was not sufficiently well grown or well educated to direct him aright. I observed just now that, in fact, there have been certain vague attempts at referring gravity to some very uncertain isms. These attempts, however, although considered bold and justly so considered, looked no farther than to the generality, the merest generality of the Newtonian law. Its modus operandi has never, to my knowledge, been approached in the way of an effort at explanation. It is therefore with no unwarranted fear of being taken for a madman at the outset, and before I can bring my propositions fairly to the eye of those who alone are competent to decide upon them, that I here declare the modus operandi of the law of gravity to be an exceedingly simple and perfectly explicable thing. That is to say, when we make our own advances toward it in just gradations in the true direction, when we regard it from the proper point of view. Whether we reach the idea of the absolute unity as the source of all things, from a consideration of simplicity as the most probable characteristic of the action of God, whether we arrive at it from an inspection of the universality of relation and the gravitating phenomena or whether we attain it as a result of the mutual corroboration afforded by both processes. Still, the idea itself, if entertained at all, is entertained in inseparable connection with another idea, that of the condition of the universe of stars as we now perceive it. That is to say, the condition of immeasurable diffusion through space. Now, a connection between these two ideas, unity and diffusion, cannot be established unless through the entertainment of a third idea, that of a radiation. Absolute unity being taken as a center, then this existing universe of stars as the result of a radiation from that center. Now, the laws of irradiation are known. These are part and parcel of the sphere. They belong to the class of indisputable geometrical properties. We say of them, quote, they are true, they are evident, unquote. To demand why they are true would be to demand why the axioms are true upon their demonstration is based. Nothing is demonstrable. Demonstrable, strictly speaking, but if anything be, then the properties, the laws in the question are demonstrated. But these laws, what do they declare? Irradiation, how? By what steps does it proceed outwardly from a center? From a luminous center, light issues by irradiation, and the quantities of light perceived upon any given plane, supposed to be shifting in its position as to now be nearer the center and now farther from it, will be diminished in the same proportion as the squares of the distances of the plane from the luminous body are increased, and will be increased in the same proportion as these squares are diminished. The expression of the law may be thus generalized. The number of the light particles, or if the phrase be preferred, the number of light impressions received upon the shifting plane will be inversely proportional with the squares of the distance of the plane. Generalizing again, we may say that the diffusion, the scattering, the irradiation, in a word, is directly proportional with the squares of the distances. For example, at this distance b from the luminous center A, a certain number of particles are so diffused as to copy the surface B. Then at double the distance, that is to say c, they will be so much farther diffused as to occupy 4 such surfaces. At treble the distance, or at d, they will be so much farther separated as to occupy 9 such surfaces. While at quadruple the distance, or at e, they will have become so scattered as to spread themselves over 16 such surfaces, and so on forever. In saying generally that the irradiation proceeds in direct proportion with the squares of the distances, we use the term irradiation to express the degree of the diffusion as we proceed outwardly from the center, conversing the idea and employing the word quote-unquote concentralization to express the degree of the drawing together as we come back towards the center from outward position. We may say that concentralization proceeds inversely as the squares of the distances. In other words, we have reached the conclusion that on the hypothesis that matter was originally irradiated from a center and is now returning to it, the concentralization in return proceeds exactly as we know the force of gravitation to proceed.